Hello and welcome to Transcending Sport with me, Chris Stafford. My guest today is Lori Okimura, who has spent her professional career in a variety of areas, from volleyball coach to sports governance. She's been a volunteer, sponsor, club director, facility manager and event organizer with extensive experience in sales, marketing and promotions of various major international sports, organizations and events, primarily in Olympic and Paralympic sports. In 2019, she was appointed an executive board member to the board of directors of Angel City Sports, an organization based in Los Angeles, California, focused on providing opportunities through sport to adults, children, and veterans with physical differences and impairments. Lori serves in the leadership of World Paravolley, which is the International Federation for Sitting and Beach Paravolley. She's been a member of the International Volleyball Federation and since 2004 has been a technical delegate for the FIVB World Tour. Lori was appointed by World Paravolley as an international technical official for sitting volleyball for the 2020 Tokyo Paralympic Games and is certified as a technical delegate for sitting and beach paravolley events. Having been subjected herself to discrimination and harassment in sport, including ageism, gender equality and racial injustice, Lori is passionate about helping others. Her focus now is prioritizing athlete safety through her work with International Safe Sport, sharing her experiences in adaptive sport and helping young people to find their paths in sport. Lori, thank you for joining me and welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I was interested when I found you on social media. Isn't that the way we meet people in this pandemic world?
That's the way now.
And I read a little bit about you and the work that you've been doing in the areas of, safeguarding athletes and safe sport and also your work, because you were subjected to discrimination and harassment. So you have firsthand experience of what athletes, can be subjected to these days, and the gender inequity and racial injustice that I'm afraid, pervades across sports and really does transcend sport. So I was curious to talk to you about your work. So why don't we start with a little bit of background as to that, just to set the scene for why you are passionate about doing the work you're doing today?
Right. So, well, I the best way I tell my story is that I've actually had almost every job in a single industry, and that's in the world of sports and in my sport, in volleyball, various disciplines of volleyball. It was an interest, a personal interest. I grew up playing volleyball as a child and playing lots of different sports really. And then got to the point, just as I was hitting college, that I was no longer able to play myself. I had an injury and an injury sort of exacerbated itself. And while I can still enjoy, recreational activity and such, it just made it impossible for me to continue at any, high level of competition. So I think, looking back, that probably had a lot to do with springboarding my interests in staying involved in sport, but looking for other ways, right, to be involved. And we talk about transcending, it's you have that moment. And certainly I was, nowhere near being like a retired professional athlete, but, professional athletes have that moment, right after their last competitive, whether it's a match or game or anything. And there's that sort of moment of like, oh my gosh, it's like surreal, right? You're not quite sure it's over. It's not really over because you can still be involved, but certainly competing at that level, it means something different, right? And so for me, I got really lucky with the people I was surrounded with. I had a terrific mentor in college who just retired from 43 years as the sports information director at the University of Southern California. So I give a little thanks to my mentor, Tim Tessalone, who brought me in the fold as an intern, and was one of the people that showed me there was a possibility of having not only, involvement, but an actual career and a life still involved in sports, but on a different side, right? So instead of on the field of play, here is what the business of sport, looks like. So my, to sort of encapsulate everything, my career has been sort of twofold. One of professional endeavors, always sort of paralleled by this career in volunteerism, which is sort of what has brought me into this world of safeguarding and addressing more what I always refer to as more humanitarian type issues in sport, right? And that's been through some of the volunteer experiences that I've had. On the career path, having multiple viewpoints, right, perspectives, or having all these jobs in in one area, it lends itself to this really unique lens, of sometimes I call it cynical. You're somewhat sarcastic because you've seen something from both sides. It's harder for someone to pull the wool over your eyes, right, about what may or may be the case. But also you get to see the pleasures of competing in sport and participating in sport, but you also get to see the challenges, right? And that gives you, I think, no matter who you are and no matter how you get to see those different perspectives, it gives you an appreciation, maybe a deeper appreciation if you can no longer compete at that level yourself, but it gives you an appreciation for what the people involved actually go through, right? Whether it's the athletes themselves or the coaches or the officials or even the parents and fans and spectators, watching the game.
I think you see it from a wide-angled lens, really, don't we? When we're able to step back rather than that, telephoto or Zoom, the Zoom where you are very much involved with the day-to-day play, so to speak, which you were, weren't you? I mean, you were into volleyball in a big way.
Absolutely.
Are you still? Do you still get on the court?
I don't as much. In fact, more beach volleyball every once in a while with friends, but not very frequently. I had a medical condition arise about 15 years ago. And so that has limited activity, any physical activity, whatsoever. So when I can, I try. I've, in fact, become very enamored, I guess might be the best word, with sitting volleyball as well as other para sports. I just tried goalball, went to a clinic with USA Goalball not too long ago, because my approach is I like to try to understand about the different sports that I didn't get to play when I was a kid. I played a lot, but there's certainly so many more now on the landscape. And so I try to, whenever I'm involved in something on a volunteer level, and now I'm working with adaptive sports, I'm volunteering with this great organization and I got to try all these different sports.
I love that. And I want to talk more about that. Laurie, because obviously that's a huge growth area, isn't it? The Paralympics has been one that's just mushroomed over recent years now, and there's, a significant item on the sporting calendar, which used not to be, because as you said, the landscape has changed. There are that many more sports that are available, both for able-bodied and for para athletes too. But explain a little bit about how your journey went into the para world, into adaptive sports, and what you're doing now.
Right. So my journey began as a fan, and it was back in the late 90s. I was really fortunate to become acquainted with a gentleman, the late Mike Hewitt, who was himself an amputee at the time that I met him, and was also very involved in not only coaching but identification, development, pretty much every aspect of volleyball for people with disabilities. So it was both standing volleyball and sitting volleyball. And today, sitting volleyball is the official Paralympic discipline, and put in a little plug for the USA women are the back-to-back gold medalists at the Paralympics. So that's fantastic. A dynasty in the making.
And you got to go to Tokyo, didn't you?
Yes, I worked at the Tokyo. Yes, I did. So I'm involved with World Paravolley, terrific organization, the International Federation for sitting volleyball, and also a new discipline, beach paravolley. And because of my work with them, I was able to very carefully and very anxiously make the journey to the Tokyo Paralympics, and just fantastic job by Tokyo. I mean, I think Japan, is one of the cultures that reveres sport, so much, but they didn't really have a lot of support previously for parasport. So this Paralympics, obviously for lots of reasons during the pandemic, but I think this Paralympics was especially important or meaningful, to them, because it gave athletes with disability and also those that participate, who maybe don't have or not living with a disability, but support and are allies. It gave them really a terrific, reminder of why parasport is so unique, right?
Would you say that the US is leading the way, rather, when it comes to, because volleyball per se, the sport across all of the options, is very much a mainstream sport here in the US? Do you think the US are leading the way when it comes to beach para volleyball?
I actually, I would love to say that we are. I think we're definitely in the mix and definitely part of the evolution, but it's actually countries like Australia and a lot of the countries in Europe that are picking up not only beach para, but beach volleyball in general and volleyball and sitting volleyball, but they are really picking up steam, in opportunities, especially with younger kids, so I would very lovingly say that, our sport in the world of volleyball, it's very global, right? It has a global appeal. It's visually pleasing. But what I've been really excited about is the interest, from the continents, right? From every continent, but also the fact that, we do have opportunities in the United States, that we can welcome other countries to come and participate, when we get back open and everybody's, able to travel again, but that there are equal opportunities arising in other areas as well. Brazil has always had a very vibrant volleyball community in general, but sitting volleyball as well, and beach para volley. I mentioned the Australians. The Australians are really, really picking up steam and are extremely dedicated to all things volleyball, right? and that includes, as a terrific group, a guy named Nick Coburn and a terrific group down in Australia that are kind of, pioneering the development, right, of beach para volley. So while we do our part here in the U.S., I think we've definitely got some company now on the landscape, which is terrific. Right.
Now, you're involved with establishing the first board of directors of the LA Volleyball Club to pursue its first of a kind inclusive and adaptive sport curriculum for indoor and beach volleyball disciplines. That's impressive. I mean, and what timing too, because 2028 will see the LA Olympics come back again, this time with the Paralympics.
That's right. Well, the Los Angeles Volleyball Club was actually founded by a really good friend of mine and a former champion volleyball player. His name is Jason Olive, who had a long career in the entertainment and modeling industry. So he's very diverse, right, in his interests. But Jason, has created this model. I mean, club volleyball is not new, to the landscape, but the model that Jason has created with the LAVBC is, to me, really unique because it not only focuses on elite level, actually their emphasis and their, priority focus is on recreational and development. Right. So they're getting kids that are really young, their first opportunity to see and participate in the sport and keeping them involved. Sometimes we talk about youth sports and there's the sort of like, the over-parenting conversation, there's the over-involved conversation, there's the specialization conversation, there are lots of different conversations swirling around. But, the other part of it is we're always talking about how do you keep kids involved? How do you give them access? Number one, and then how do you keep them involved, but then also allowing these kids the opportunity to try different sports, right? And that's the model that LAVBC has. And because of my involvement in an organization, it's called Angel City Sports in Los Angeles. It's an adaptive sport, really more of a human rights focused, organization, offering multiple sports, because of my interests there. The LAVBC were kind enough to extend an offer and said, okay, we're just getting started. We'd like to form our first board of directors. Can you help us identify, some people, but also, what is this sitting volleyball? This is fantastic. We saw the women win the medal for the USA and we've seen, some sitting volleyball at some of the tournaments that they participate in, around the country, but, we'd like to try it, and I think the misconception, about adaptive sports is that it's only for people who are living with disabilities, but it's actually not. right? I mean, at the competitive level, certainly, there you have to classify and qualify to compete at the most elite level. But in the communities, especially in the community we've built in Los Angeles, one of the greatest things is when you see a family, with maybe the child has a disability or the parent has a disability, but they're playing together, right? They're on the sitting volleyball court together. So it's adaptive sport for people with and without disabilities. And that, I mean, how much more inclusive.
That's really cool. Yeah. And I think that's something that maybe people misunderstood, because they think of adaptive, they think of para as being very separate from able-bodied sports, don't they? So this is as inclusive as it gets, as you said. It really is.
Right.
Yeah.
And from the para athletes perspective, I know a lot of Paralympians and even medalists that, that have had careers along their journey in non-adaptive sports settings. So there's some athletes that played Division I women's basketball, and then they went on to win, medals in another sport in Paralympic play. There's a Paralympian. There are a couple Paralympians that I've met recently that have told me they're on their journey that they've actually played in the Paralympics in more than one sport. They competed in one or maybe won a medal in another. And so, in terms of, when you talk about adaptability, when you talk about inclusiveness, that really, those are terms that that the Paralympic world of sport, like, not only understand, but have been embracing all along. Right. This is nothing new, to their community, but, through LAVBC, through Angel City Sports, organizations like that, what's been kind of, really rewarding on a personal level is when you see the kids, playing together, and some of the parents will say, my daughter, I have two daughters, and there was a family I met recently, one daughter is, she uses a wheelchair. She has a spinal cord injury. The other daughter, while not in a wheelchair, also has a very mild, physical disability. And oftentimes it's, they're very close in age. And oftentimes the parents have told me that they can't find, a mechanism for them to play together, right? There's no opportunity for them to play together. Oftentimes, kids with disabilities are discriminated against in mainstream sport leagues because of the fear that either they will get hurt, because of their disability, or they might hurt someone else, right? So it's a very isolating, I'm learning, it's very isolating and lonely process. So when these parents are able to find, other parents or other families with kids, and they would, hey, do you guys like to play baseball? Let's find let's find some other people, and let's get a group together. That's sort of the philosophy that we've been using at Angel City Sports. Like, hey, everyone can play. If you guys want to learn a different sport, great. Let's find somebody who can teach it to them. We can all play, and then let's give some access and some exposure, both ways, both to the sport, for their identification purposes, but more so for the people. And then you've got kids, so this family I met, their daughters were playing sitting volleyball, sitting side by side. And I didn't realize, at first, until I looked over and I kind of let it sink in, that, this is one of the first times that this family has seen both daughters on the same team, being able to play together. Right. And that's pretty remarkable, to be able to witness. Right? So.
Yeah. And I love that you're passionate about finding ways for people to, get introduced into any sport and what it can do for them to empower them, and the skills that they will learn that are transferable beyond the sports field. So would you say in terms of, the adaptive athletes, the para athletes, when they look at, we'll stay with volleyball because that's your sport of choice. Do they look at the able-bodied athletes, the gold medalists, of course, as you reminded us, that was pretty awesome. Do they see those as their role models, or do they have para and adaptive athletes who are becoming their role models now?
Well, it's interesting because the more that I'm around these younger adaptive athletes, before they hit the Paralympic level, the more I'm realizing that, or appreciating and getting to see, that phrase representation matters, right? And we always knew that about, whether it's sport or life or, professional career path. To see other people that you can relate to whether it's the color of your skin, the color of your eyes or hair, or that, that I met a young girl. She said, I've never seen anybody play sport that doesn't have a leg, right? That's an amputee like me. Right. And she was about 8 years old when I met her, and, consuming all things para sport, became her mission after that. Right. No matter what sport it was, because I think, to understand it correctly is to understand that sometimes, when they're kids, these kids are told, these parents are told, like, your child's not going to walk, or they're not going to be able to play sport, or, there's all these no's, right? These nots, right? You're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able to do that. But what if we turn that around and said, okay, but here's a possibility, right? Here's what you can do, right? Here's what you're able to do. Here's what is available to you. Or, what is it that you'd like to try, right? And let's make that happen. Now, I'm not an expert, right, on the world of parasport. I'm learning, right? Like I said, my journey began as really, somebody incredibly enthusiastic. I saw standing volleyball was the first, parasport that I'd ever seen. And it was really, a couple things inspired me about that. And I was looking at it, of course, the job that I had at the time was sort of as a sponsor, in that, from that perspective. And so I'm looking at this new sport and thinking, things that inspired me was I saw men and women playing together, which was really interesting, right? There are very few opportunities you can see at that competitive level. I'm certainly co-ed open gym, there's always, I played co-ed open gym, but it's different when you see it at such a high level. And of course, the women, unfortunately, and woman, I should say, who was involved at the time, she wasn't able to represent the U.S. on that team because, multi-gender sport disciplines were not recognized, at the time, right? So there was no co-ed standing volleyball and or sitting volleyball, and there still isn't at the highest levels, right? So there's a bit of a barrier, there. You've seen some adaptive sports that that do offer co-ed opportunities or mixed gender opportunities, and that's fantastic, but not every sport is there yet, right? Not every sport can provide that same classification or that same opportunity. But for me, what attracted me were really the kind of the personalities involved. There was a lot about it. In parasport, I noticed that a lot of the athletes were able to have longer careers, than those that I'd seen in other non-adaptive sports. That their average ages were a lot older.
Even if they come to it later, they can stay longer very often. And I've mentioned to you before, my background is equestrian sport and para dressage. Right. For one, you'll see athletes who have no legs, double amputees, and also blind, and they can still ride and produce, Paralympic performances, which that in itself, it still amazes me, what they can do. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I don't know you well enough to know if you've ever ridden a horse, but can you imagine riding a horse if you were blind or if you were a double amputee?
That's right. And I've only been on a horse once, and I can't imagine, right? Because I needed a lot of help to get up there, and the whole ride didn't last that long, But getting back to your original point is that, so yeah, I think that now I'm more aware of the sort of the idolization, right? But it's not that, I don't think that it's, one discipline of sport idolizes the other. I think it's the people and the athletes, and their authenticity, right? And their story. Their story, right, is what endears us, to them, no matter what discipline they're in or whether they're Olympians or Paralympians, and I think that what I've liked seeing, especially, in the sport that I'm in volleyball, is that, there really is a mutual respect developing that's been developed between the athletes and the different competitive categories, whether you're Olympian or Paralympian, right? Yeah. And I think that a lot of that, and I may be, just drawing on my own recent experiences, but a lot of that comes from when people get to experience a sport, no matter what it is, right? Then they get a different appreciation. You either become a fan, or you realize, like, oh gosh, it's a lot hard. Usually you're like, wow, that's a lot harder than it looks, right? Yes. That's one of the first things, first phrases that comes out. But I notice it particularly with adaptive sport. I've got some friends that, sort of hyping up the Olympics and the Paralympics, to them. And, then they'll see some sports, on TV and go, wait, what is the deal with that? Like, why, and then the questions come, right, which you want. And there's some questions, we can answer by just looking up the rules, but there are other questions that you can't. And so, telling them to follow certain athletes on social media, or bringing them out to a clinic day. And if they live in Los Angeles, bringing them out for, we run a lot of Paralympic sport days for Angel City Sports, where people can come and they can try different sports. So like if you're the parent of a child with a disability and you've never actually, sat in a wheelchair and played wheelchair basketball with your child, like you can actually do that. We'll give you the chair, we'll give you the mechanism, and the parents can play alongside, and the spectators. Like I don't have a child with disabilities, and I myself, am not a competitive para athlete, but I love the opportunity to try the different activities, because it gives me, as somebody who tries to promote and market these sports, it gives me some creative juices, flowing, right? It gives me an sort of a perspective that, okay, all right, I get it. Now, how much does this wheelchair cost? Okay, we need to raise that money to buy more, right? So, but for the parent experience, it's, you really get a greater understanding, not only of the physicality, right, of these adaptive sports and the parasport in general, but you get an idea of the mental toughness, right, that's involved. Like think about, you talk about riding a horse, but think about like being in a wheelchair and having to, wheel back and forth on the basketball court at the same time that you're dribbling a basketball.
I know, right? I mean, how they maneuver those wheelchairs. I know they're adapted. Incredible. They're adapted wheelchairs, aren't they, for wheelchair rugby and volleyball and basketball and so on. But even so, that's you're multitasking. That's for sure.
Right, and really, when it comes down to it, everybody, no matter who you are, you like to think you have a little athlete inside you somewhere,
yes.
Right? You have there's a childhood memory or a 7th grade, soccer tournament that you scored the winning goal, but everybody has a little athlete. Yeah, everybody has a little athlete in them somewhere. The key for the majority of us is, how do you take that passion that you have for the athletics and contribute to that, at least for me, behind the scenes, right? It was like, how do you not, I don't want to be a weekend warrior, right? I don't want to just play, when it's available, when I'm available, or play, once every month or something. I want to contribute, right, to giving these opportunities to people to play. Because for me, growing up as a kid, like sport was it was an outlet, right? It was kind of a safety net.
It's interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah, the social aspect of it, of course, and the team, the environment. Mm-hmm. There's so many pluses to it. We could have another conversation about the advantages of sport. I want to just come back to what I mentioned earlier, one of the other areas, Laurie, that you've been involved with, and that's safe sport, because that's a very hot topic these days. It's something that we truly does transcend sport. It's very sad, of course. It's tragic that almost every day we hear of another sport, another incident of an athlete being subjected to some form of abuse. Now, this is an area where you've also zoomed in on it. Talk a little bit about your work there and how you got involved and what it represents to you.
Right. So it's a little bit of a tough story, or tough business to be in, right? The business of safe sport, because on the one hand, it is so important to protect not only the athletes, but all the people involved, right? Whether you're a volunteer or a coach or a referee, or, it's important to keep everybody safe. But there are some very, tough stories along the way that you encounter. So how I got involved, and I'm really, really, proud at this moment that I was given the opportunity very recently in 2021 to join the board of trustees of an organization based in the UK called Safe Sport International. And the best way to tell my story about how I got involved in safeguarding is to tell it backwards. And kind of a weird way to do it, but bear with me. I got involved with Safe Sport International because they're an organization that relies on fact-based research, right? There's so much misinformation, and I think a lack of education, right, to prevent these situations from happening. And, what I loved so much about Safe Sport and their international focus and their fact-based focus, but the other thing I loved about them is that I saw it as a mechanism to create kind of more global awareness or global connectivity, right, about safeguarding in general. And safeguarding means something different to everybody, and one of the first meetings I was sitting in on, or Zooms that I was sitting in on with Safe Sport, we realized that the word safe sport or safeguarding or, protection means something different depending on the language that you speak, right? And that therein lies some of the problem, right? In some languages or in some communities around the world, there really is no concept of safeguarding athletes. Athletes are seen as either commodities, like true commodities, to be bartered and sold, or a lot of times, in developing nations, athletics can be seen as economic means to get your family out of poverty, and because of that reason, there are more risks involved, right? There's more opportunity for manipulation or for grooming and such. But how I identified that being a part of an organization like Safe Sport was important is, I had really my volunteer life, which I mentioned had sort of paralleled my professional career, but my volunteer life is sort of what led me on this path. And, as somebody who played and, early in my career, and I was much younger than I am now, I was also a coach, for youth volleyball. And I really loved it. At one point, I thought that might be something, I would pursue. But, in coaching young women at the time and then eventually both men and women, young girls, really. I had kids as young as 10 that were, in my care, and kids as, and those that were like seniors in high school in the US, which would be about 18, and, I unfortunately, witnessed some things with other coaches and their athletes that, as a human being, not even as a coach, but as a human being, like, when something is wrong. Right. You get that, sixth sense, or you have that gut instinct that, this is not, or common sense, that this is not okay. Right. This is not right. And some of the things that I witnessed and then looking back, even some of the things that I might have experienced myself, going through, whether it was verbal abuse or physical abuse or anything else, going through the sports process myself, like things became, clearer in some ways, but then fuzzier in others, right? And more confusing. And it was the practice of, putting yourself in the position of being responsible for other people's kids, right? That initially sort of got my guard up. And we didn't have a word for it back then. This is like the 80s, right? We didn't have a word for safe sport or safeguarding. There wasn't a national organization that you could go to, right? If you saw something, they always say, if you see something, say something. Well, if you saw something, it was very unclear who you should or could say something to other than the police, and when I was in my
sorry to interrupt, but there was no mechanism at all at that point. If you can imagine you and I as young girls, maybe in our early teens, where would we have the confidence to go to? Who would it be? Your parents? I'm not so sure. You'd feel that was not.
You feel embarrassed. You feel like you did something wrong.
Exactly. Right. And you can quite see how uncertain that environment would be for an insecure for young girls. So absolutely. Exactly. But sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves, just what that felt like when we were younger.
Well, and your point is so valid. Like, what did it feel like? But also, perhaps the only person or the person that we would have wanted to go to might have been a coach, and that may have been the offender.
Yes.
Not in all cases. Like, I don't mean to classify every person who coaches youth sports, as a potential offender, because they're not, right? But the ones who are, you can definitely, start to see the patterns, right? And so when I was in my early 20s, I was involved in club volleyball and, saw some things that just didn't sit right. Right. And, about 25 years later, I had the opportunity to, obviously having seen a lot of things that happened in the sport of volleyball, I unfortunately was one that very early on in its sort of like national lens, development, there were a lot of examples, of coaches. It was primarily coaches taking advantage of, having inappropriate contact with kids. And a lot of people say they call it inappropriate relationship. It's not a relationship, right?
No,
I mean,
quite.
they were basically abusing their athletes, right? And there were also examples of a lot of coaches abusing other coaches, or and so the power dynamic. There were a lot of examples of the flaws in the power dynamic, right? And about 25 years after I was coaching, and I stopped coaching, altogether, right? And I mean, wasn't any good at it, and not good enough to make it a career path. But also, I got involved in the business behind sport. I started working with this great company that actually, focused a lot on volleyball. So it kept me sort of around the industry. But 25 years after, this experience, right, and coaching youth volleyball and seeing some things that really didn't sit well, I got involved as a volunteer for the national governing body for volleyball in the United States. I served on the board of volunteers, board of directors for USA Volleyball. And I'll give them a lot of credit, the organization a lot of credit in this space of safeguarding, in that they, got on board with safe sport and the concept of safe sport and the development of safe sport very early on, as did a lot of other, national governing bodies. But they actually, as an organization and, the board itself and the people serving on the board at that time, we had a real dilemma, in terms of some cases that had come up before, people had identified a National Center for Safe Sport or the word safe sport, right? Before safe sport was in the norm, right? And there were obviously a lot of examples, and cases and things that needed to be corrected, from the past, right? And every sport went through this, right? We've seen it, we've seen it at the highest exposure levels with the case of gymnastics and the abuser, and Larry Nasser, and his monumental, probably the most monstrous case that we've seen so far, right, of abuse that went unchecked. But every sport, I mean, make no mistake, every sport, whether they're USA affiliated or not, every sport is having the same problem, is that there is a period of onboarding, to the whole concept of safeguarding, that you do have to look back in your history, right? And probably correct or address for the first time, or, at least, start to expose things that happened before there was an actual center that you could report them to, right? Like we said before, who do you go to? Who did you go to back in the 80s or 90s? It was very unclear, right? And it was very inconsistent. And then, of course, part of the onboarding is you deal with present day cases, and then you have to look ahead. Okay, what types of preventative measures, can we put in place? Education, how do we prevent more of these instances from happening? We can't prevent them all, unfortunately, right? That would be the goal. That would be the ideal. But, there's this kind of look behind you, clean up and address things that have not been addressed, right? Then you look in the present day and like, okay, we've got cases that are popping up on the landscape every day. And then you look ahead, all right, then to help try to mitigate, the circuit. Okay, everyone's got to take training. Everyone has to be certified. Let's teach these kids what these terms mean, right? I didn't know what grooming was when I was a kid. I would never have known what that term was, right? So the deeper I got into, sort of addressing the mistakes of the past and then also addressing new cases, the more that I saw inequities, right? Loopholes that that offenders were jumping through. And one of the big ones really was, there can be an offender in one sport, in one organization, right? That there was no, there really was no communication or way to share resources or information between different organizations, right? So if you were someone who was, who's found guilty of offending, whether it was criminally or civilly or just banned by your sport, from participating, in a certain level, there really was nothing that said you couldn't go from basketball to volleyball or volleyball to wrestling or wrestling to soccer, right? And as long as you passed the basic background screen, you weren't arrested for anything, you might, as an offender, be able to slip through the cracks.
And between countries too.
Well, and that was it. And that, you just hit the nail right on the head. The between countries part is how I got, really more personally involved, right, in this area. I served as the chair of the board of USA Volleyball for 5 years during the 7 that I was, volunteering. And about the time that I was ready to term off, USA Volleyball had successfully completed a kind of a private prosecution against a person that I had seen in the past with questionable behavior. We're talking 25, 30 years down the line. USA Volleyball was able to successfully prosecute this individual and achieve a lifetime ban. Right. And that was a big deal, not only for, there were some victims that, now are in their 50s, right, waiting 30 years or more in some case, for their situation to be addressed. Right. It's a no-win situation, right? It's an absolute no-win situation. Well, we're talking that's pretty significant to achieve a lifetime ban in anything, right? to get a lifetime ban of anybody in anything. And as I finished out my term with USA Volleyball, in my last year, I happened to be in another country, watching a competition with our national team. And I looked across the arena and I saw that banned for life individual, not only with a group of kids and players, but then saw a lot of posts on social media. It's like, oh, we're touring, we're competing with the Japanese. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I absolutely 1000% couldn't believe it. I happened to be in another country for business. Again, it was a board meeting, for the Confederation. And I saw people running around the sports club that we were meeting in, wearing, the jackets of this individual's club, right? And I say, where did you get that jacket? Well, Mr. So-and-so was here doing a clinic, and he's coaches us every year. I'm like, oh my God! And these kids were like maybe between 14 and 16 years old. So, therein lies the problem, right? It's not the first time that I will see an offender somewhere, and it's not going to be the last time.
Well, they're slipping through the system, internationally, domestically as well as internationally. But I would imagine the work of Safe Sport International, of course, is cross-border, right? So this is, right. We have Safe Sport USA, Safe Sport Canada, but Safe Sport International is doing this work globally, I'd imagine. So is that jurisdiction then going to be different to, say, a national safe sport organization?
Well, I think what's interesting, what to me was very interesting about Safe Sport International is not an investigative body, right? Like the U.S. Center for Safe Sport in the United States. Like that is an organization that is deeply dedicated to the jurisdiction that they have over the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic sport, but also they are completely focused on investigation and training. Right. At the Safe Sport International level, it's a little bit more fluid, which allows them to incorporate more people from different countries into the mix. So Safe Sport International hosts an annual conference. In fact, conference 2022 is about to happen in early April, and it's open to everybody who wants to participate. Right? There's no requirement. You don't have to be an athlete. You don't have to be a coach. It's open to anybody who's interested in participating. And by having opportunities like that, which is how I came to know Safe Sport International, right? I saw the notice for they had to take their conference virtual, as many conferences did. They took their conference virtual in 2021. I happened to see it, and register for it and participate in it. It was glued to my screen, because here are other people speaking the same language of safeguarding, right? I mean, of course, they're coming from all over the world, but, there were some faces I recognized. There were some faces I didn't recognize. What I love about Safe Sport International is that they really focus in on the athlete's voice, right? So for the first time outside of a private hearing or a disciplinary case, I was actually listening to these athlete survivors, talking about not only their own situation, in an extremely vulnerable position, but then focusing in together on, okay, how do we prevent this from happening to the next generation of athletes? Right. Or even our same generation of athletes, who've never experienced this or who think that they may be experiencing, some type of abuse, right? No matter what type it is. So that to me was the big game changer, right? That athlete voice,
absolutely.
Which is something that I value, I really value, because along the way, when there has been anything about sport that I haven't understood, wanted to get a better insight on, or just get, my creative process is that, okay, I'm going to go immerse myself, right, in whatever it is that I'm trying to, market, sell, promote, fundraise for. And the athletes have always been the resource to me that have provided the most meaningful engagement, but also like that sort of aha moment, like, oh, wait, what if we took their need here and matched it with this, this goal here. And okay, yeah, great. Now we have this terrific marketing campaign, or now we have this terrific product to sell, right? So SSI, they're really focused on the athlete voice. They empower the athlete survivors, which I love, right? They give them not only a voice, but or recognize their voice, but they give that voice a platform, right? And the desire to achieve global parity within the organization is like fantastic, right? That's a key theme. It's like we always have to think globally, right? They have researchers all over the world. They have people like myself that are really just, we're not experts, we're not researchers. I'm not an academic, but I work in this space, right? I see things, I hear things, I know people that, that we can connect in these different countries. And that's part of it. It's helping to build education and making it understandable in different languages. Like what does safeguarding mean?
Really, really. How do people find out more about this organization in the Safe Sport International, Laurie?
So one way I think was the best way is to, you can follow us on social, but to go to our website. It's safesportinternational.org. And there is a sort of basic outline of what it is that we do, but also what it is that you might do that could be of interest. How do we partner, right? So there's, focus on education and different, how do we, not start from ground zero every time, from step one, like how do we work together? How can we amplify what you're doing in your country? How can we put you and your country in touch with other people around the world that, that potentially can be an ally,
absolutely.
Right? Or a resource,
so it's
right?
very much a networking organization too. So it turns up the volume on these topics globally,
right?
As one voice.
And they provide, consultancy. They provide, training and education opportunities. They're working with the IOC, the IPC, with lots of different organizations. And these are people who, the people who are started SSI, who, give it life, right? And Tivas, based in the UK, is the CEO, who has a, decades long career in child protection, right? And athlete protection and research. And, so it's really, for me, right, the best place that I could find to start the process of connecting the dots, right, around the world. Like it's one thing for me to call or Zoom or email a colleague that, that I've run across over the years. And certainly I'm trying to pull as many of those people, into the mix, into the network and the relationship building. But it's a whole nother thing when you can get on a Zoom call with people representing, the different continents. And as the topics come up, or as the urgency in connecting the dots, becomes more clear. And then you all go back to your communities, and then exponentially, right, that outreach grows because you've just been on a call with people from 11 different countries.
Yes.
Right. You've just attended this conference, and heard these athletes speak about their experiences. It's like, wait, I know somebody who, who's an athlete, who's a survivor, that may be a really interesting voice. You connect the dots, and then you see all of the athletes, organized and supporting each other and sharing resources. Yeah. Right. And this is a global digital community that we live in now.
Yes. I think right? This elevates it all in so many different ways and empowers the 100%. Athletes as a priority. This is wonderful work, and we could talk about it for a long time. Laurie, I'm mindful that I'm taking up so much of your time today, but I'd love for you to come back, if you would, after the April conference and talk about what the findings were from this year's gathering.
Absolutely.
Would you mind doing that? That would be fun.
I would be happy to.
And let's keep this conversation going. I really appreciate it. And Laurie, you're doing such sterling work in so many different areas, obviously a very busy woman. And I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on the show and tell us more about your work. And more power to you, Laurie. Keep it up.
more power to all of us. I mean, really, it's podcasts like this. It's coverage that you provide and amplifying, people's voices and especially the women that are working, in the industry. That's a big part of the process, right? Okay. For us to share our stories and to have a platform to engage with each other, right? The number of people, I mean, and okay, of course, pandemic, but all of us who work in international sports, we're used to the video chats, and they're not as sophisticated. They weren't as sophisticated back then as they are now, but these opportunities, right, to speak together or to listen to others, speaking about their experiences, they connect us in ways that allow us to continue to do the work.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, and that's, incredibly important. So thank you for giving all of us the opportunity and providing us this great platform.
Absolutely. And my pleasure. And I look forward to you coming back, and we'll keep this conversation going, Laurie. But for now, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to come on the show. Stay safe out there, and we'll circle back in a few months.
Thank you, Chris. You as well.
Well, my thanks again to Laurie, and if you check our show notes out at wissports.com, you'll find the links to this episode with the resources that Laurie referred to. That's at wissports.com. As always, you can post your comments, questions, and suggestions via our social media at wispsports, and you can also reach us via email if you prefer to info@wispsports.com. We would love to hear from you if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for guests on this or any of our other shows here at Wisp Sports. And if you have a moment whilst you're on your podcast app to leave us a rating or a review, that always helps others to find our podcasts. And wherever you're listening to this, remember you can find Wisp Sports and all our shows on different podcast apps. So there's somewhere to listen to us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And thanks again to my guest, Laurie Okimura, and to you for listening and helping us turn up the volume on women's sports.